Board might be able to share about the same topic, soil mitigation, the fees, how it works in practice. We have a bill, H128, that sort of was the starting point for this conversation, but we're and happy to hear your thoughts on any of it, but we're really looking at Section 2 today and what it means to have a 1-to-1 ratio versus whatever the current ratio might be. And you heard me ask, I think earlier, the question about, from a financial dollars standpoint, what does that actually look like? So we got a little context there. But happy to hear anything you have to say, and then we'll probably have questions.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to try to be brief and say a couple. I'm sure you got a lot of background from the agency, but just so you know, this idea did not come from the Housing and Conservation Board. It actually came from a Franklin County developer named Phil Gerbode, who, when we started our program in the late 80s, he was developing housing in Franklin County and doing other kinds of development in Franklin County. And he went to the environmental board and to us and said, you're conserving land in Franklin County. And when I mitigate on site, you end up having stranded land that's not used for agriculture, really. It becomes somebody's big lawn. Wouldn't it make more sense if I paid into a fund and you could use that to conserve land and really strengthen ag communities? So for good or for bad, that's where the idea came from. And that district commission said, okay, let's give that a try. And we signed an MOU and became the administrator of the funds. So we do not have a role in negotiating with any developers about what the deal is going to be. We have not set the ratios. The one thing we do based upon the appraisals we receive as we buy development rights from landowners is to give that information to the ag agency and this went from being an informal process that the legislature knew about to being memorialized in statute probably 20 years ago. So it's really the agency's role as a statutory party for, I guess is it Section 9B? I'm not an Act 250 expert, to really deal with those deals. And they use us and our expertise to then distribute those funds. And the funds are used for two purposes. The primary and overwhelming majority of the money goes to buy more development rights. Most of it is matching federal funds on a dollar for dollar basis. And what that means is it enables us to draw down more federal funds than we would have been able to if we just had the amounts that are appropriated every year by the body. So it means we're doing more conservation work that way in the way of permanent easements. And it means that every dollar is generally, there are a couple of exceptions where we don't use federal funds, leveraging a federal dollar. The other thing that we've put the money to, and you memorialized this in statute, is you got a request a few years ago from the Ag Agency to be able to use some of the funds that are received for them to staff their role in being a statutory party and dealing with all the 9B projects that come before them. So we don't make the determination of when on-site mitigation is appropriate and when off-site mitigation is appropriate. And I think developers still have the option of on-site mitigation. We have, in the last 5 years, used, I think it's been a little under $3 million to fund 34 farm projects and about 4,000 acres of conservation. The last 5 of those deals, so 29 have closed, 5 more will close between now and end of September. To get to your question about what would the impact be financially, I can't answer that precisely. And I think the answer you got is it all depends on where it emanates from and how much money was going to be generated. But the lion's share of funding comes from District 4, Chittenden County. And so of the funds on hand over the last 5 years, 1.7 million got generated in the Chittenden district, 222,000 in District 9, which is Middlebury, 193,000 in District 6, which is Franklin. And although very rare that we see anything from the Northeast Kingdom, Casella, I assume because of their trash to energy plant, paid in $182,000. But that's rare that we see anything coming out of the kingdom.
Why is it rare?
There's just not enough development activity on prime ag soils that would generate a reason for there to be a fee paid. And obviously, there's the most activity. When we began to do business with the Environmental Board, they originally insisted that the funds be spent to mitigate harm within the district. We're not required to do that now, but that's still our goal. And if funds are sitting around too long, our general agreement with them is we'll try to spend it in an adjoining district. So some Chittenden funds may get spent in Franklin or Addison, as an example. And, with counties that are giving us small amounts of money, it's not hard to spend it within the county. All the funds that get spent after there's an independent appraisal that has to be done to federal standards, and that's the basis of it. We do, although I think we're authorized, we don't use any of these funds for our own staff costs or operating costs. We just give us an appropriation and we handle it that way. So I think that's my overview of what our part of the program is. As to your question about, should you make adjustments or lower it? I think I leave that to you as a policy issue. But I would say to you, almost everybody would like you to waive or lower their fees. There was a proposal last year, and I think you did not do it, but to waive fees for the expansion of the Franklin County Airport. So everybody wants to pay fees. Anybody want to raise their hand? And so I think the policy issue for you is, when are you going to make exceptions or make changes? Some years ago, and we've actually supported projects that, with our affordable housing mission, that did have to pay the fees. And so I think about 5 years ago, you lowered the fees for housing to 1-to-1. I think about 10 years ago, you lowered the fees for industrial parks, and the rationale that was given was that when an industrial park is permitted, we're making a public decision and spending public funds for the infrastructure to it, but that's where we want industry to go, and therefore it's okay to lower the fees in that setting to make that economic development happen. So I leave it to you and all of your colleagues here about when is it appropriate to lower fees or not lower fees, because obviously we're an interested party, and we think we put the money to good use, and up to you to set the policy that ends up saying how much will we get. But if you look at it just from the perspective of where the dollars being generated, the most, well over 60%, maybe 70% most years is coming from one district. So from that perspective, it will have not a big impact if you're, as I understand it, you're being asked to lower it for forest-related businesses. And so my guess is that won't happen too often in Chittenden County.
Representative O'Brien.
Yes, can you just describe what happens? Is there a queue of potential, land that you would like to use that money for? Do you work with the Vermont Land Trust?
Yeah,
You have it.
we receive, under our statute, we can receive applications from municipalities or nonprofits to implement our mission, and they apply to us for grants. So the primary user of the Development Rights Program is the Vermont Land Trust in conjunction with farmers. So a farmer comes to them and they prepare the application for sale of development rights. And there's a pipeline of probably at this moment 40 projects that we don't have all the funding for, and they're from every part of the state. And, so occasionally, dollars sit waiting for a project. And as I said, we used to have an 18-month rule, and then we'd go to the next county over or the next district over if nothing came forward. Chittenden County is the place that generates most of the fees. The cost of protecting land there is much higher than every place else, so it's usually not hard. We've done a lot of good conservation work in Charlotte. We've done a little bit in a few other places, Milton, Williston. So there are still opportunities for conservation in Chittenden County.
What are the federal programs that you're leveraging?
The primary federal program we leverage is the NRCS. It's from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and it's called, the initials are ASIP ALE, Ag Land Easements, is what the ALE part of it stands for.
Gus, you had cited some numbers.
Yeah.
Could you go over those again and the time frame?
So over the last 5 years, and I can put this in writing, we have used proceeds to conserve 34 farms or do 34 farm projects of about 4,000 acres. 1.7 million came from District 4, 222,000 from District 9, 193 from District 6, which is Franklin, Grand Isle, and 182 from District 7, the Northeast Kingdom, and there might be some smaller amounts that would make up a total of something near $3 million.
And that's the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And this has been going on, you said.
Since the 90s. The number I was given, and we're having some problem with the database today, is since 2001, we've received $8.1 million. So values have gone up the last few years, and that means that the receipts have gone up as well.
So the objective overall is to preserve prime ag land.
Right.
So what we do is we allow people, if they pay money into the pot, to build on ag land so that we can further preserve more ag land.
Yeah. So again, the first 15 years of Act 250 until Phil Gerbode, as a developer, went in and said, let's do something different. When you wanted to mitigate the impact of your development, you had to do it on site. Mm-hmm. And I don't think anybody's.
What does that mean?
It means that when you got your permit, you had a restriction that you were going to develop these 10 acres, but the next 30 could not be developed. So it was a form of an easement. Some people might argue it was permanent. My understanding is that permits are good for 20 years and you could reapply for your permit, and I suppose the conditions would stay in place. And I think you can see this in Chittenden County. You'll see these big buildings surrounded by lots of lawn. Mm-hmm. And they're not being farmed. And I assume, at least I heard Chuck Ross, when he was Secretary of Agriculture, called them stranded parcels. The suburban area with lots of traffic around them. And, maybe they could be used by a vegetable farmer, but certainly never. So the land was protected through on-site mitigation, but it didn't protect agricultural activity necessarily.
Right.
And I think that was the rationale that said, okay, let's have more dense development where we're agreeing there's going to be development of whatever sort, and let's use the funds to make sure we're conserving land where there's going to be a stronger agricultural
I get
community.
it. Thank you for clarifying.
I think that was the rationale for why the environmental board back then said, okay, and why the legislature, your predecessors, said, let's then put this into law.
Mm. Since then, though, haven't we lost a lot of, prime ag soils, I think if I remember correctly, less than 1% of Vermont is under prime ag, right?
I think it's more than that. And there is so what Act 250 calls to protect are what are called primary ag soils, which is different than what NRCS defines prime ag soils and secondary ag soils.
Right, it's different.
And primary ag soils under Act 250 encompass both that prime, like the Connecticut River bottomland, but secondary soils that lots of people, and I'd go to your vice chair who knows, has forgotten more about agriculture than I will ever know about where one can farm and where one can't. And, but we are looking at that when we're utilizing their funds in terms of making sure that we're conserving, looking at the kinds of maps that prior witness Ari was talking about in terms of where we're taking these dollars and investing them.
And it sounds like most of them are coming from Chittenden County in those areas.
In those areas. I mean, again, we've done some work in District 4 in Middlebury. We've done work in Franklin Grand Isle. The other thing I'd say is that while, as I think all of you know, there are lots of farms in the state that are not just fields. There are about a quarter of what we think of as farm parcels are actually covered by forest. Some farms have wetlands on them. So there are other conservation benefits accruing when we're conserving a parcel of land as agricultural land, generally.
Is other ecosystem function?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gus, do you ever dip into the bigger VHCB budget, the budget number we talk about a lot for the same program,
Yes. Yeah. The primary, we're spending every year between $2.5 and $3 million from the Housing and Conservation Trust Fund to buy development rights from farmers. And that's generally being matched, as I said, by this federal program the Natural Resource Conservation Service has. But they've provided more dollars than some years we've had match, and that's where these dollars have really come in handy. And just by the way, I am told that program that every year gives us between $2.5 and $3 million a year from the feds. Next year and the year after, we're likely to get an extra $6 to $10 million, and we will not. So I raise that for you as a future budget item. I'll be in here saying, if you want us to draw down all the federal funds, just as you've heard the governor talking about drawing down all the federal funds for infrastructure, we'll need more resources in order to do that.
Those would be match funds, those things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Are they dollar for dollar?
That's my understanding. We haven't gotten guidance on them yet. We've just been told by the state conservationist, this is what we expect for the next federal fiscal year.
We heard earlier, Gus, that outside of the designated areas, downtowns and village centers, that the default is on-site mitigation. And so not paying a fee, but doing it the old way, or the way that.
Well, that's where they start. My understanding, and again, I'm not at the table to negotiate that. That's where they start everything is, can we do on-site mitigation? I think that I'm not sure how they apply that standard. That's a question for them, but I think that they have allowed the development of primary ag soils and allowed mitigation payments outside of downtowns and designated areas. I think the mitigation is less in the downtowns and mitigated and designated areas, and it's more when you're outside of them. And I'm sure that they look at, is on-site mitigation possible? What does that mean? Will we end up with a stranded parcel that's too small for somebody to farm? Or does it really have some agricultural potential when they have those kinds of proposals?
Right. Taking in the context of, again, this particular bill and the forest products or the woods products industry wanting to expand. And we heard a couple of examples. I think if they want to expand on existing land and they don't own enough land, then if they're doing it on site, somehow it means acquiring neighboring land or limiting their expansion to just a fraction anyway of the land available.
Yeah, I serve as an ex officio non-voting member on the WELA board, and I know this has been a discussion among some of the forestry experts. And I don't have a strong feeling that whether this is a major impediment or not. Obviously, the forest products industry in Vermont has suffered greatly for lots of global economic reasons over recent years. So I am not here to say this would have a major impact one way or the other. It's a hurting industry. And I think the public policy for you and the decision you made about affordable housing was you'll allow that to happen at the lower ratio, which I think is what the sponsors are proposing. And I think you just have to weigh that against how many other people will come in and say, we have a good public policy reason. I think there's a different question with the permitting process, which is much broader than Act 250 of how hard is it for somebody in a small business to navigate and comply. So it's not just whether you pay a fee, it's do you need to hire an attorney to navigate it? Do you need an engineer? Do you get timely response from the Agency of Natural Resources, which is actually separate permits from your Act 250 permits? Are you getting good advice along the way? Or are you getting overlapping advice that confuse lots of people in small businesses that are not environmental engineers? All those sorts of things, I think, make navigating the process a challenge for any of us.
Is there any statutory charge that these stranded parcels have to do something in agriculture at any point, or?
There may be a requirement that they have to cut them once a year or something like that. I don't know. But there's no you can't force anybody to farm, I don't think.
Right. It'd be interesting for like this committee to have a policy for all the people who want access to land, to have access to some of those parcels.
I was just speaking to the agency about that, and they're in the process of compiling a list of all of those parcels that have been mitigated, whether on site or not, and trying to figure out what to do with them.
Yeah, and there may be some landowners who would, it may have been conserved 30 years ago when vegetable farming was a much smaller part of our ag economy, and maybe there's an owner who'd say, yeah, that'd be great. I'd love a vegetable stand next to my office building, and let's match somebody up. So maybe there's some potential out there that we've yet to untap.
Is there a map you think of?
Not yet. I think you're saying that the agency is working on developing one.
Yeah.
Great. Well, seems like we've run out of questions and run out of steam possibly.
Okay.
Thank you for coming in.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you. Good luck on the ride home.
Yeah, thanks.